Well, thank you so much, Reed. And let me thank all the reactors and presenters and Bill Novelli as well. Just a terrific set of conversations. And thanks to all of you for so many great questions and comments. So just to recap, we started off with a look at the landscape. And from that, we went to some of the principles for ensuring equity in AI. We're now going to move to some of the leading work that is occurring as we speak in terms of utilizing AI to address disparities and importantly, support health equity. We have three terrific panelists who will each take about 7 to 10 minutes laying out, and then we'll have a reactor session. So the same structure as before. Thus, it's my delight to introduce now together, and they'll speak obviously sequentially. First, John Halamka, who is the president of Mayo Clinic Platform. Matt Might, professor at the Hugh Call Precision Medicine Institute at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And then finally, Suzanne Tamann, who's computer scientist with the Veterans Health Administration. And so let me pass the podium over to John Halamka. Good to see you, John.
Well, wonderful to see you, Dr. Perlin. And I've got a couple of slides, but here, let me illustrate a point by using a physical object. This is a John Deere 2032 tractor. Now, you may think of John Deere as a company that makes vehicles. It is actually a data and AI company. Several years ago, John Deere decided that it would instrument every tractor with GPS, tachometer readings, moisture readings. So imagine this, imagine if for every crop in this country, you knew who was harvesting it, the weather patterns, how much fuel was being used, the quantity they gathered, the quality of the good, you would have the world's largest precision agriculture database. John Deere then surrounded itself with thousands of partner companies, collaborators, and joint ventures to turn this massive amount of data into action. Action for farmers, action for suppliers, action for commodity pricers to know the price of soybeans 2 months from now. So I tell you that as just a foundational example, because now let's take that to healthcare. And go ahead and go with the next slide. So at Mayo Clinic, what we have said over these last 18 months that I've been there, first, we must gather novel sources of data beyond traditional EHR data. We want to get the data that you have from sensors that you wear, devices that you carry, devices in your home, curate, ensure that data has provenance, that we've separated signal from noise, and then prepare it for interaction with AI algorithms. Recognizing that especially for novel data types, one problem we have is there are not so many standards for high velocity continuous readings, such as you might get from a lead 1 ECG or galvanic skin response, or even sleep data that you may have from a sensor in your mattress. So this first function is gathering, curating, and filtering. Once you've done that, you can do discovery. Mayo Clinic has 158 years of data. It has structured data, unstructured data, telemetry, image data, omics, digital pathology. How do you put that in a longitudinal experience so that you understand patient wellness over time, not just an episode of care? How do you de-identify it so that you can use this data for discovery in a privacy protecting and ethical fashion? Mayo Clinic worked for a year to de-identify 60 petabytes of data, place it in a secure container in Google Cloud, and then invite AI collaborators not to share the data, but to come into that secure cloud environment and run algorithm development and validation against the data that's de-identified and always under Mayo control. And this way you can't do linkage and re-identification of the data, and it is really a machine-to-machine interaction, not a human reading through that DID data. And so in that fashion, we produce algorithms. We've produced about 60 thus far. Some of those algorithms have been taken through randomized controlled trials. Some have been taken to FDA. But Jonathan, here's a challenge. Jonathan and I have been friends for 20 years. The great thing is neither of us age. We're going to take a Mayo Clinic algorithm developed on 1 million Scandinavian Lutherans, and we are going to run it in Tennessee. Is it going to work? Is it going to be biased or fair? Is it fit for purpose? Does anyone know? So very key, and it's really pertinent to this last discussion, we must have a national validation guideline, an implementation guide that says how should an algorithm developed on a given data set be then rigorously and transparently validated. In fact, it might even be a testing laboratory that results in what I will call a label, like a soup can has a label. I'll show you an example in a moment. Once you've taken it through that rigorous validation, which might be alternative federated machine learning or different data sets, it might be a randomized controlled trial, and you have transparency as to when an algorithm is useful for purpose, you'll then want to deliver it in workflow so that a clinician, a pharmacist, a payer, a patient has the benefit of knowing what they are using for what purpose and can take action based on the output of the algorithm. So this is what Mayo Clinic has worked on for the last 18 months in both internal and external companies, collaborators, and joint ventures. And there are several new algorithms that we have released. And let's go to the next slide. We have, through cardiology, developed ejection fraction measurement with, believe it or not, an AUC of 0.93 measured through a prospective randomized controlled trial, identifying cardiomyopathies, pulmonary hypertension, even detection of COVID from lead 1, 6 lead, and 12 lead EKGs. We've taken 200 million radiology images, de-identified them, and done the largest of its kind analysis of normal body composition to use that to understand variance as a patient with a disease state may vary from what is expected body comp in fat, muscle, and bone. We've created algorithms for the production of radiation oncology auto-contouring profiles that reduce human time to produce a full linear accelerator treatment plan from 16 hours a case to less than 2. We've taken oncology breast cancer algorithms from 84 different input variables to forecast who will develop breast cancer and can a medication be given today to avoid breast cancer in the future. We worked with Change Healthcare and had access to 31 billion encounters and 16 billion associated social determinants of health from non-traditional data sources like car ownership, property ownership, these kinds of things that can be used to better understand social determinants of health and its impact on algorithm development. And finally, we just published a preprint which will circulate on looking at the address you live. What food do you have access to? Public transportation do you have access to? Are there particular health conditions in water or other environmental factors at that address? And use that as part of algorithm development. Final slide. This is an example of what I think we need. Data transparency for every algorithm that is used, a soup label. Who went into the production of this algorithm? How was it validated? Where is it fit for purpose? And it's only when we get to this level of transparency in the algorithms that we publish about and use in practice that we can restore credibility in healthcare AI. Turn it back to you, Dr. Perlin.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hlamka. As always, exciting, extraordinary work, and look forward to testing the Scandinavian Lutheran algorithm in Tennessee. You raised great questions about National Validation Laboratory, and with that, let's turn to a colleague one state to the south of me, and that is Matt Might.
Thank you, and let me just share, I need to share my screen. Yes. All right. Well, I'm excited now to talk about really bringing AI to the front lines, right into the clinic, and the intervention on behalf of individual patients, and give you a sense of what that's like and the tools that we're using, and how we deal with issues of equity that are not dissimilar from prior issues in equity within medicine. So with only 7 minutes, I'll just start by telling you what's not in this talk, and where you might find that. There's really three things I won't be talking about today. I won't talk about what precision medicine is. I won't talk about any non-AI approaches to precision medicine. And in fact, I'm going to limit myself, strictly to using AI to do drug repurposing. That is, finding a new use for an old drug, often in the context of just one patient or a small group of patients. What I will talk about are, how we do, how AI can be involved in this process, this repurposing process. Very specific examples using actual patients or patient groups to do this. And then a thought about how it is we might more equitably apply a tool like this in practice. And to jump to the answer all the way at the end, I'll give you a hint, is to actually involve more humans and human intelligence when we're using artificial intelligence. And we do that in a very specific way. And in fact, I've now found out that there's others that are thinking about doing it the same way that we are. So I think there's something here that might be scalable. So first of all, I'll just give you a very brief overview of the platform that we've developed to help find potentially unforeseen treatments for intractable conditions. And it's called Medicanron. It's actually been quite generously funded by NIH through NCATS and what's called the Translator Program. This community is out there essentially trying to provide structure to every biomedical data set ever. And so we get to leverage that as part of this community, and gives our tool some unique power. So what is this tool that we built? Well, in a nutshell, it's what you get when you combine old school logic with high-speed automated reasoning to achieve superhuman-like deduction with clinical insight. If I had to egregiously oversummarize what it is. Now, you can ask this tool very low-level questions. You can say, hey, I need an inhibitor for this target X, and it can go off and search all of its data sets and try to find one or infer one. You can ask it more high-level questions, like what could be a treatment for this condition X, and it can try to figure that out. So for example, if you ask it to think about potential treatments for overactive bladder, it can come back with 145 suggestions, all of which are justified with citations to either places in the literature or existing biomedical data sets. So how do we build this tool? Well, we did an awful lot of reading, around 30 million abstracts from PubMed. Now, fortunately, it wasn't the grad students that had to do all the reading. That was all done with artificial intelligence, courtesy of some of the existing tools out there for doing natural language processing of the medical literature. And all the other data sets that have been imported as part of this translator consortium that NIH has put together. So just give you a peek inside its brain into how it thinks and how it encodes what it knows. You can think of its brain as consisting of a bunch of circles. And these circles are nouns, but they're specific nouns in the biomedical literature. There are things like genes and drugs, symptoms and diseases, and they're connected by verbs to form relations. So if you draw an arrow from one circle to another, you've expressed a sentence in the brain of this AI. So for example, if you wanted to express the sentence Prevacid inhibits NGAs, this is how you would do it in this system. And the advantage of encoding knowledge this way is that it allows us to make inferences. So for example, if we know that concept blue increases concept red, and these could be drugs and metabolites and anything you might find in the biomedical literature, and we know that red decreases green, we can make an inference that blue should decrease green by increasing a decreaser. So this is sort of knowledge that's out there hidden in the literature, but may not explicitly stated, or it's a hypothesis, if you will. So its brain is really a soup of these facts, and that allows us, as patients reach out to my institute, to try to find ways to help them. And the first example I'll show you, I've got two quick examples here, is the case of ADNP-driven autism. And this is shared with the community's permission. In fact, I'll give you a link at the end to a news story that's come out recently. This is the first time that Medicanron made a prediction that resulted in a successful phase 1 clinical trial. It all happened because the president of the ADNP Foundation, a mom, reached out and said, hey, can your tool find anything that might increase the expression of ADNP, which is the gene that's underactive in this particular form of autism? So we asked the tool, hey, what upregulates ADNP? And it shot back, have you considered low-dose ketamine? So we passed this back to the science folks at the foundation. They spent a year, with the patient community through this foundation spent a year doing their homework on it. digging up the necessary literature to get it to the point where they could do an actual clinical trial. That actually launched at Mount Sinai because they ended up believing that this will do exactly what we predicted it will do. The trial launched in February 2020. Things got a little delayed with COVID, but they were kind enough to point out that if not for the suggestion from this AI tool, they never would have actually launched the trial. The trial finally got going in September with the delays from COVID, and it recently completed. And phase 1, even though it's not an RCT yet, it's just sort of for the safety, they saw significant improvements in almost everything they could measure before and after. So, for example, they did in fact see the expression of the target gene double, which is what they'd hoped to see, because that means that the working copy of the gene is compensating for the broken copy of the gene at that point, and broad improvement, a significant improvement across all the clinical and parent-reported measures that they looked at. So this is quite exciting to see this. And if you want to know more, there's a long piece on this in Stat News that talks really about the whole process of how this happened. And the last case I'll show you is actually a very non-genetic one. It's intractable cyclic vomiting. And in this case, we had a 19-year-old woman who was having multiple episodes of severe vomiting and nausea every day. By the time her parents had reached out, she was only 78 pounds. And they said, well, we've tried all known treatments. There doesn't seem to be anything out there that works for her. And this allows us to flex a different part of an AI tool like Medicanron, because we could look across all the literature that's out there, of which there's 30 million papers. There's 64,000 on nausea. There's 4,000 on treating nausea. But you can figure out quickly that between these 4,000 papers, there's 347 distinct treatments somewhere floating around out there. And you can organize these essentially like a histogram. And if you rank them, you'll find that the number one treatment by the number of papers in support is Zofran. Not surprising. There's 169 papers for this. But if you move out down the ranks in terms of literature support, you get into what we call the unknown known. There are published treatments that are very infrequently cited. And so there's not a lot of knowledge about these. And if you go out to only 3 citations in support, you get to a region where you find nasally inhaled isopropyl alcohol, so sniffing, essentially rubbing alcohol pads. And when we checked with her team to see if they'd tried this, they said, we've never even heard of it. But as it turns out, it did in fact arrest every episode of nausea she had from that point forward, to the point where 8 months later, she was up to 125 pounds. And not only that, she actually got married when she was able to get out of the hospital and after her high school sweetheart had proposed to her. And he was even able to move across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast because her condition was finally so well controlled. So if you want to know more about this, we've got a piece up on the UAB news site describing this story. And the last point I want to touch on is, how do we scale access to a technology like this equitably? I really think we need a secret ingredient. We certainly have one at UAB, and that secret ingredient is people. As it turns out, AI really needs people. And in this case, we use students all the way down to undergraduates that engage in a program as essentially coordinators to help interface between the various parts of care in a complex process like this. So here's on the screen, you see some of the ones that are currently and previously a part of this program. But really what they do is they coordinate with the computational tools, the medical team, the patients, and scientists trying to find the next step for every patient on their treatment odyssey. And again, a big part of this is accessing the AI tools that have been built up, and they access them on behalf of the patients that reach out. And I think that having these navigators as the interface to AI, even for clinicians, is actually going to be critical in making sure that it is equitably distributed. It turns out we're not the first to figure out that trainees are a great way to make an impact on equity. So I have to mention a friend and colleague, Liz Cohn, who's been doing essentially the same thing using nursing trainees to just give people in underserved communities access to the medical literature in a comprehensible way. So this idea that trainees can be a gateway to more advanced knowledge, I think is a really important one. And so I think the lesson here is that to really get this kind of technology out there, AI is going to have to leverage human intelligence and really human emotional intelligence as well as we reach out to every community that deserves this. Thank you.
Let me thank you, Matt, for a terrific presentation. I am delighted to know that we humans are not entirely obsolete in the era of AI, and that there's power in the conjunction. With that, let's turn to a very large health system perspective, and pleasure to introduce Suzanne Tamann, computer scientist at the Veterans Health Administration. Welcome. I believe you're on mute, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. So great to join all of you today. Wonderful reminder of the potential of AI in healthcare, but the need to really address some fundamental issues to ensure we don't exacerbate any existing health disparities and just make care delivery more equal in general. So I am an instructor in biomedical science at Stanford, in addition to my VA hat. But I do get this really wonderful experience to work with the VA as a partner. I'm based at a program evaluation resource center, part of the Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. And I work with a team that's led by Dr. Jody Trafton, and does a lot of work with both the development, evaluation, and deployment of real-world risk prediction tools, and also part of a program called ReachVet that we have at the VA. So two really important outcomes that we're concerned with at the VA and the population at large is suicide and overdose. So I will share with you what has been a little over a 2-year experience diving into some of the issues around algorithmic bias in our tools, which really started with a group of students. So in summer of 2019, I had worked as part of a data science for social good program at Stanford. We really wanted to provide an experience around algorithmic bias in healthcare risk prediction tools, but also considering that, you know, many algorithms that we're developing in research really aren't executable at the front lines of practice. So we really wanted to find an operations partner that was deploying a model and focused on an opioid risk stratification tool that's used at the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's used by hundreds of clinicians each day. And it really is to mitigate and potentially reduce overall poor outcomes among the veterans related to pain management. And it isn't just one model estimate that's produced, it's actually a whole dashboard of various types of decision support factors, including the patient's risk, interventions they're on, recent utilization. So, you know, it is a tool that is used for risk prediction, produces certainly a quantifiable estimate of that risk, but it is contextualized with broader information. So what we did, we used de-identified data really to just start exploring this issue, see what we could assess in terms of primarily focusing on racial and ethnic bias. As I mentioned, our partner was the VA, but also the FDA's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity was, you know, a really nice partner to integrate into some of this thinking. We first reconstructed STORM, which is the predictive model used at the VA from de-identified data, and really showed that the performance behavior was similar. So after that point, what we did was work with the subject matter experts at both the FDA and the VA to identify a set of measures of bias that, one, were meaningful to them and that were, you know, interpretable. And, you know, we wanted things that were easy to convey. I think visualization helped us to provide some of this information for the purpose of discussion, and just making sure that if we wanted to engage leadership, if we wanted to engage groups of veterans, if we wanted to engage, you know, clinicians, that, you know, we really had to make sure that people understood the measures and that they were, you know, if they didn't understand exactly how they were computed, we're given some intuition for what they mean. We did find evidence of bias related to race, ethnicity, also looked at age and gender. I will mention though, VA data, these models are developed and applied on the same population. We also do have in our models around 17% of the veterans were African-American, Black or African-American. Certainly some subgroups in there with small representation, such as Pacific Islanders. But I do think, what we found was evidence of some statistical bias. Really couldn't determine if there was clinically relevant bias at that point, meaning that, did these differences really result in a change in outcomes among various subgroups? But nonetheless, it also pointed to issues with needing recalibration. So I know that I think it was Dr. Tuxen brought that up earlier, but that was something that also became quite apparent, at least in epidemiological research and health services. A lot of models are fit in sample and not applied to a test set. So we really started to see this when we prospectively applied these models to future panels of data. And what all this really did was create a lot of area for discussion with leadership, where we should go thinking about, the actual storm model and how it's used at the VA. We started to embark on various initiatives, as well as other colleagues in this area. And I thought it would be good to share with you some of the things that we really learned in the wild, in a sense. And a lot of this is evolving as I speak. So, we're still learning more, determining like what's relevant, how to address it, even where we can get the data and compute infrastructure to do that. So a few key things, and our keynote speaker, I think, mentioned this too. It's quite clear biases in the healthcare landscape, and it's certainly baked into the foundation in some sense. And there's a number of reasons why that is. It's definitely important to audit this, but it's not a one-time process. I actually think it's probably more along the lines of something that should be integrated in continuous process improvement. So, thinking of the quality improvement literature, I mean, it isn't a one-time deal. The population changes, the landscape of risk may change, and that's something else that we noticed in really just this demonstration on de-identified data. So we also realized that once we started to think about applying this within the VA, we actually do have a reasonably diverse population, at least more diverse than what you may find in some employer-based claims. But again, not race and ethnicity wasn't, although in general these measurements were determined to be good, there was lots of variation across facilities. So, and this is something that I think we've refocused on again and again with various offices, but are we measuring race? Is it self-reported? Is it clinician reported? What are the pros and cons of that? So even thinking about if we want to address bias within certain protected groups, are we even measuring these variables well? And are we measuring them across facilities with the same type of fidelity? So definitely more of a national scaling issue, but certainly, important to keep in context. I think I mentioned the need for visually informative types of measures. So conveying that information to really engage everybody. You don't want somebody not to weigh in because you've sort of overloaded them with, very useful statistics and modeling behavior that, is informative to, model designers and developers, but may not be generally understood. And then I will just touch on one of the other key aspects, which is where we're focusing now, and just continues to be a learning experience as we are applying our bias analysis to the actual storm data. But there is this, it seems like an actual chasm between a research or a development model and how people actually implement this in practice. So often a model is developed years prior to its implementation. There are certain nuances of the data and compute systems that may need to be changed or adapted based on, say, differences in the population, or perhaps a clinical need to extend the model more broadly. So there's various types of assumptions and modifications, explicit modifications where models are adapted to a new use case that's slightly different from the development or the research model. And it's really important that we not only rigorously assess this type of bias that could be introduced in the development, but really ensuring that how that model is implemented is really a good reflection of the development model. And also, that model is really what we want to evaluate and really start the discussion around versus what appeared in more of the research paper, although that's certainly the first step and, foundational, but really the need, this divergence between development and research and what actually gets implemented several years later and by an entirely different team. And then I'll just mention too, one other thing that we are trying to get a little more involved with, and I think is a very nuanced but important area. We are moving more towards NLP analytics, but right now, a lot of what we've seen, at least in healthcare, is, although there are some exceptions, a lot more on structured data. But, as we're leveraging notes, other types of, multimodal data, we really need to start, rethinking how to build fair models, what that means, and good ways to evaluate them. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for another terrific presentation and a great juxtaposition with Matt's presentation expressing the importance of human knowledge. You've teed up that in the context of local or regional variation, you may need to expand to a broader data set, yet, if you will, the average signal may need recontextualization in those local or regional environments. And this will be part of what I know will be a great discussion. We've got four terrific reactors, let me introduce Amy Salerno first, a practicing physician in geriatrics and palliative care at the University of Virginia Health System. Following her comments, we'll move to a group set of comments from Ngozi Moses, who's executive director of the Brooklyn Perinatal Network, and she's joined by her colleague Lavone Moses from Coursera Ventures, as well as Amy Vreeland from Pathways to Community Hubs Institute. Thank you all for some brief and I'm sure provocative reactions to the terrific presentations. Amy?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. And what an amazing panel and day today has been so far. So thank you for all the prior speakers and allowing me to talk. I have a couple of reactions. First of all, I wanted to highlight that juxtaposition that you just mentioned between the last two presenters. I think one, kind of thinking about how do we empower individuals to utilize AI for what it is that they want to use, or how do we make sure that AI can be used by individuals for what it is that they're wanting. And then the other is really, how are we using AI on individuals? And I really think that actually gets to the crux of what equity is. And it's really, as mentioned before, an issue of power. And so who has power? And so if somebody raises their hand and say, I want AI to help me with X, they have power and they're able to do that. And who's the one accessing that system versus a health system determining that they would like to use AI on their patients in order to quote unquote better serve them, but does the patient really want that? And so thinking about that, so here at the University of Virginia, I was part of working on implementing a natural language processing AI platform to identify social determinants of health that were already identified in our free text of our clinical charts, and surfacing it so that we could then better meet the patient's needs. And it's really interesting. I think that kind of label bias that was brought up earlier is so true, because it's what is the purpose of surfacing those social needs, and is it really to help our patients, or is it to decrease the cost of those high need patients? And depending on who was at the table to make the determinations of how we used it, very, very depended on what it was that they were suggesting we would do with that data. And so really thinking about kind of the shared decision making and shared power and who's at the table to make those decisions about what you're doing with the data has been it's a really, really critical thing as you're thinking about using AI on patients. And so just as a really good example, we know that housing instability and people experiencing homelessness have much higher healthcare utilization and a lot more comorbidities with substance use disorder and mental health issues. But we also know there's a lot of bias in healthcare against people who are experiencing homelessness. And so just because we have it documented in the medical record doesn't mean that people who are experiencing homelessness want that flagged for every single person who's interacting with their chart. And so how do we work together with the individuals who are experiencing homelessness and our homeless service providers to make sure that what we're doing is actually working with them rather than working on them so that we reduce our cost. And so I think that the crux of equity really is really on what is the purpose and goal of that AI tool, and who's been part of that decision making of what the purpose and the goal of the AI tool is. And I think it's really interesting as we've listened to all of the various like real world implications of the AI tool, all of the different goals of them. And so really thinking about that. And I'm excited to see where this goes.
Thank you very much for those terrific comments, because I realized in our past conversations, we've been talking about protecting communities or cohorts, and you've raised the important concept of the individual within a community as another element of the power sharing or power balance relationship. Let's move forward to Ngozi Moses and her team for additional reflections. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you much for this opportunity. It's been a real learning experience for me to hear all the perspectives, and I'm happy to add mine. I'm from a community-based organization with a mission to get people with risks that need to be mitigated to improve outcomes from point A to point B, to access the resources and to get their information to the medical providers. So it's very interesting to learn about the intentions and the tools for AI and multiple learning that helps to, is intended to increase this. My two colleagues are the experts in this area, but I just want to mention what I've heard today has, I've heard very little about the importance of the relationships that are lost between the client and the provider with the massive use of AI when technology replaces people in making the decisions for services. And the issue of trust and clients being able to trust that technology can deliver and understand what they need is something we've seen that doesn't work, and all of the presenters have talked about that. I want to also say there was a question about how long it takes to correct and change. And the question I say that needs to be asked is, what would it cost if we don't correct and change in terms of continuing to do business in the same way and probably getting the same results, which has been the American experience. I hand over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Ngozi. This is Amy Freeland. Thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts and your research, and thanks so much to CHAC and DHAC for letting me join this discussion. What an interesting couple of hours. All the work discussed here to reduce bias in clinical algorithms is really directionally wonderful, as is the work that John Halamka noted from a social perspective from the change data. I look at all these advances in research being discussed today from a social care prism, particularly around vulnerable populations. We all know that about 80% of what keeps us outside of the healthcare system is not medical and not healthcare related. It's all of the other things. And we know that's particularly true in vulnerable populations. I'm speaking to the converted. I know we're all working in this space. People may not take their meds because they need to spend their paychecks on food. They may not go to doctor's appointments because they're more concerned about finding housing, and because they don't have transportation, and because they think the ED is just a fine place for regular care. They may be suicidal because they're desperately lonely and isolated. I'd say that even the most thoughtful organizations that are capturing social care aren't necessarily capturing it in a super holistic way. So I have 4 comments. So how do we leverage AI to change the game for these populations regarding social care? AI lets us train models on data, but there's really a dearth of data on social care interventions and the impact they have when they're completed. the organization I'm working with, Pathways Community Hub Institute, we've amassed data for over 20 communities across 10 states. It's structured data, it's clean data, and it's gathered from in-home community health workers on all the interrelated actual risks the individuals face. It's from a risk registry that researchers developed about 172 mitigatable risks across medical, social, behavioral health, and safety needs. And it also tracks the actual work it helped individuals needed to take to mitigate these risks with their community health worker, and also data on what prevented it from getting mitigated. So my question is, how can we apply AI to learn from this? Is there a way to identify social signature combinations of risk and risk mitigation? Can we really strive for precision social care? And can we then marry this with healthcare? And can we eventually get to the point where we're able to identify social bundles of care that can be repeated and appropriately compensated, just like we do for knee replacements and hip replacements? And additionally, how can we create a semblance of semantic interoperability and technical interoperability as we begin to look more at social care? Even as I say this, I'm starting to realize AI in social care makes it more likely that we take that individual person's need out of something we are trying to call whole person care. To Ngozi's and others' points, I also want to ask, how do we ensure that the AI work we're doing doesn't add to the distrust of these populations? As Reid and others have noted, many individuals in vulnerable populations are distrustful of the system, be they be from Black communities, refugees afraid of the US authority, those involved in criminal justice. As we use AI to identify more people for appropriate care management, that might mean more automated interaction. And so much of social care really requires human interaction and human touch. So how do we leverage this data and use it in a way that's human and culturally sensitive? And how do we ensure that we're not taking this social care data and using it to do duplicative outreach? 4 case managers working with a person isn't better than 1 case manager working with a person and building trust. So how do we help to make sure that we're using that data to prevent that from happening? Another point I want to ask and put out there is, how do we ensure that this AI and the output doesn't add to the financial imbalance between health systems and social community-based organizations? Some of the social care network directories that you're probably aware of have AI inside to highlight at-risk individuals. And it makes it very easy for providers to refer to community-based organizations. And in many cases, these CBOs are being overwhelmed in communities where these technologies have been adopted. How can we look to include the community-based organizations in the payment mix so that they're compensated for the work that they do that helps lower costs in healthcare? So I think that's an interesting question for AI. And as health equity is such a big part of today, I just want to put out there the question, are we medicalizing social care? Are we over medicalizing social care? So yay, collectively, the US is taking a more serious look at whole person care, and AI algorithms are looking at equity and bias. And there's so much government invested in communities as a result of COVID, and all we've learned about inequities. But how do we look at this work with an eye towards sustainable change and equity? And how do we prevent it, again, from being over medicalized? Health systems are asking about social determinant needs, but interventions, even the updated ICD-10 Z codes, are pretty medicalized. So how do we know this data is going to be used in AI and machine learning. So how can we infuse this information around social care into these AI algorithms in a meaningful way so that we're working on improving equity and keeping people out of the health system long term? And I'm completely with Amy Salerno. How do we use AI with vulnerable populations instead of at vulnerable populations? I think that's an important question today. And with that, I hand it over to you, LeBeau.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity. This has been a powerful conference. Both the presenters and the reactors have brought out some really great sentiments, facts, and insights that I echo. You know, I think some of the themes that have come out are the fact that it's clear that AI and machine learning has tremendous impact on advancements in medical science, in treatments, in how we service the community. But it's also clear that these models lose their efficacy when the information is not accurate and not complete, when we don't have the right data quality, when we're not going to the right sources, and when that information is not being updated on a timely manner. It's also come out very clear that trust is a major factor in getting that information if we want to achieve equity in healthcare. And the reality is that in order to obtain that trust, you have to work with trusted sources. So I echo those sentiments from my colleagues throughout the day. I have a significant background in information technology controls, as well as in data privacy. And so I am very familiar with the fact that any system will only work with what you put in it. It's critical that organizations work with community-based organizations, larger organizations work with community-based organizations in order to build the trust with the community so that the right information is coming into the systems. When I think about the model that the Mayo Clinic, John from the Mayo Clinic mentioned, gather, validate, deliver, discover. I loved the model, but my question is, where is that gathering happening? How is that validation occurring? Who is included in the validation process? If the people in the community trust community-based health organizations, the community-based health organization becomes a key piece in the validation process. And if they're not within the process is incomplete. Delivery. Is that information that has been validated then being delivered back to the community-based organizations that serve the people? If our goal is health equity, then those community-based organizations need to be part of the equation in the delivery of that information also. And then the discovery, I really like the focus on the social determinants of health. The best way to get a grasp on the impact from that perspective is working directly hand in hand with the organizations on the ground who are not just reading information about the participants and the environments that they're living in, but are actually in the environments with them, assessing them in the environments and receiving the feedback from them real time. So the models are great, but they're not efficacious without the partnerships. And that's really where I want to focus. Matt also mentioned including EQ in the AI models. I thought that was really powerful because EQ is a critical component that does tie to your health. But in order to really get a grasp on how to measure it and what you're measuring and what that measurement means, you have to have a touch with the people. The label for every algorithm, great suggestion, but where is the data coming from? There's no point in a food label on a can if it's wrong, if it's incomplete, if it's inaccurate. And so really want to focus on how we create some partnerships with the people on the ground who can help ensure the equity, because there's still a gap if those partnerships don't exist. And those partnerships really need to be equitable partnerships in of themselves. What do I mean by that? I would propose that it is absolutely critical that paid partnerships exist between organizations that are assessing, that are analyzing, that are building these algorithms and this machine learning, and the community-based organizations. So there's a two-sided value proposition. Community organizations need funding in order to continue to serve the people on the ground. They need funding in order to continue to properly assess the populations that the medical community needs to include in their algorithms. And allowing for that to happen requires dollars. Creating paid partnerships rather than pulling that information without returning dollars to the community organizations allows for the work to continue. The medical community, the technology companies building this machine learning, organizations like the Mayo Clinic and other great organizations that are out there doing this research, this tremendous research, which is absolutely critical, will now have up-to-date, timely, complete information on an ongoing basis. Why? Because they have created strategic partnerships that funnel that information to them. But you can't expect partnerships without the resources to keep them going. And so that's really what I think is missing in this discussion, is how do we create a strategic partnership or strategic partnerships with two-sided value propositions, where the community health organization that is on the ground serving the people and helping to ensure the resources get to them, and then can provide that information into these AI channels and machine learning channels and into these large institutions performing the research, so that both sides of the equation are receiving what they need, and the constituents, the most important part of the equation, the people, are getting the servicing, the medical treatments that they need. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those terrific comments on all of the reactors. Well, let me invite the panelists to turn your videos back on. We'll get into some discussion. But as Matt and Suzanne and is available, John will be a couple moments, join. I just want to synopsize that really appreciate very much these last comments on precision social care, this issue of distrust in terms of and mechanisms to better engage the community, some prescriptions for not over medicalizing, and the need for resources as community-based organizations are engaged. You know, this rings very true to me as someone in a health system as we look around us at the COVID pandemic. That interface has proven to be very fragile, and so your words ring very true. It also reminds me of you know, an aphorism in the UK with the National Health Service: "Nothing about me without me," in terms of the need to engage. So with those comments fresh in our mind, I'm going to take the questions in slightly different order, but turning it back then to Matt and Suzanne in particular, one of the questions that came in is just on this issue, on examining data and food insecurity. And we found our predictive modeling based on social demographics offers some predictive value. What are your recommendations on how to engage patients' communities to develop models? So you've heard from a community perspective. What is the system perspective that you're thinking about, or in fact already doing, to engage community? Suzanne?
Sure. So I'll say one thing is my office does not use what some people might qualify as creepy data. And I would certainly encourage anyone that feels uncomfortable using any type of data in predictive analytics to err on the side of not using it and scrutinizing, you know, the provenance, why it's being used, all of that. So anyone should feel totally comfortable, you know, bringing that up or voicing that, expressing that interest. Likely others share it as well. And part of that is, you know, I work closely with mental health clinicians that are on the ground, and they are concerned about, say, you know, social media. You know, I actually do think, and there's evidence to show this, that other types of data like social media, activity monitoring data, cellular data. These are likely very useful for improving some of the outcomes we're looking at. But we do want, veterans to come in. We want them to engage with their mental health clinicians. They make a ton of effort developing a relationship with a veteran, experiencing not just mental health issues, but also housing instability issues, food insecurity issues, all of these. And I'll just mention too, we have been extracting some of these social determinants from using natural language processing methods now. And one of my colleagues that I'm working with, Dr. Adam Studley, he's at the Minnesota VA. He held a town hall where, they could ask veterans about some of these sensitive topics, engage them, and even express like terms and concepts that they think are important for, say, identifying social connectedness or really more of a risk factor like troubling relationships. So, I think there's a lot that needs to be done with partnership. And I think earlier, participatory research was mentioned. So I think that the major issue, as I think Dr. Moses is alluding to, is there needs to be financial incentives too to kind of build these partnerships and pairings. The healthcare is a lucrative industry. I think around 18% of our GDP right now. So the incentives need to be aligned with improving outcomes. And, our outcomes are not better and actually poorer in some key ways to our like Northern European and other European, partners. So I think there's lots to be done, and engagement is the key, but figuring out how to do it is the problem.
So the National Academy staff have indicated that we can continue this session until 55 minutes after the hour. That's 8 minutes. I'm going to ask for very pithy responses to these questions. But Matt, if you want to weigh in on this, and then I'm going to give you a heads up that we're going to switch to the institutional self-governance or governance broadly that allows this to be responsibly conducted. So Matt, any reactions to this before I throw out the next question from our participants?
Yeah, very briefly, I think, I've really enjoyed listening to the session, and it's occurred to me what's missing from some of my own work on the technical side, and that's that I feel I'm overly focused on the molecular and not enough on the social when it comes to the data that we focus on to use for treatment. Now, luckily, we have the humans in the loop to act as that sort of emotional intelligence to close the gap, but I think that we're missing out on an opportunity to make the tool even smarter by including the social in addition to the molecular.
Okay, so thank you for that. For anybody that's actually institution associated, I'd like your perspective on one of these questions that came in. What should institutional and industry governance look like when adopting and deploying AI technologies in healthcare? Another piece of that is for industries without the scale of a Mayo Clinic, for example, that develops its own algorithms. How can an organization reduce bias in implementation and adoption if algorithms are broadly deployed as a software as a service? Amy Salerno, you'd like to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I think that when you're talking about governance, you have to think about, again, like who has the power in the room. And so if you're trying to build a governance that's equitable, you need to make sure that you have the stakeholders represented in a room and that you're actually giving them power, not just an advisory panel. So the ability to say yes or to say no, and for the institution to be accountable to that group. And the group has to have representatives of the people that you're trying to impact. And so if you're working on social determinants of health or a natural language processing or like identification of social determinants of health, you have to have a larger representation of people who have health-related social needs on your panel than you do of executives of the health system. And they need to have a larger number and they need to have the actual power to say yes or no. And so I think that in order to build equity, you have to create a governance structure that has acknowledges the differential in power that already exists and works to correct it. And so I that's kind of my thought on that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Let me just throw it open to the panel for brief response. At the very first session, we heard about the concept of need for sort of ethical standards broadly. In the absence of that, Amy, maybe this is back to you. How do we not run the risk of either the good risk of individual innovation, the downside risk of something that's too variable to be as useful as possible across different environments if every institution is its own island? Any thoughts there?
I mean, I'm going to let others weigh in too. I do think that there is some kind of push and pull, just like in AI, like the data is only trained on a specific subset of people. When you're implementing things, there is so much variation. After being a clinician practicing in like 8 different organizations, including the Indian Health Service and an academic medical institution in the North and the South, culture is different in every single place. And so what would be implemented in one place wouldn't work. Like on the Navajo reservation, what I would implement there would never work at Yale. And so if I think about it, like you really still do need local governance of local stakeholders for whatever it is that you're implementing. So I have a hard time, but it's really hard to create systems that make that happen broadly, I realize.
So local governance and local engagement, but would the standards be conserved across, say, for example, the country, or? I
think you could create some standards that like require specific ideas about representation and power, but I open it up to others to see what they think. I don't know.
Well, let me come back to John Halamka, and thanks, John, for joining. There's a lot of discussion about engagement with community and this concept of precision social care, underlying issues of distrust, et cetera. And the question to you is, what should institutional industry governments look like in adopting and deploying these sorts of technologies? So John Halamka, to you.
Well, thanks so much. So per this just general topic, this idea of local tuning, local efficacy and usability is so key. I was speaking with Eric Horvitz last week. He is a chief scientist at Microsoft, and he had worked some years ago with some data in Washington, D.C., developed an algorithm, and literally took that algorithm 2 blocks away and found that it was no longer useful for purpose. And so getting back to what I was talking about transparency, local tuning, absolutely key before we deploy an algorithm. And then as it is used, obviously these algorithms are not truly humans who are doing thinking. They are providing probability and statistics that has to be overlaid with the human in front of you. The clinician and the patient can be augmented through these things, and we need to be sure that it's going to make that relationship stronger, not weaker.
Very much Matt's point in terms of integrating human. Now, there are a series of questions that I want to throw out, which are on moving clinicians. Let's say we get some of this infrastructure in place to being more or less inclined to accept AI-based predictions while simultaneously being sensitive to the limitations. What is the way that we should be training our next generation of caregivers, and to just capture the context of this conversation, members of the community to thinking about how to adopt to these technologies?
Well, if I could just jump in for a second, I think it almost needs to be the other way around. It's how do we train the tools to work with the clinicians? So, given how close we are to clinicians, given that we have to get a clinician to accept every recommendation we make, that's heavily influenced the design of the tool to the point where it will emit essentially a logical argument every time it makes a recommendation. Because if it just says, I think you should try X or Y, no clinician could or really should trust that. There has to be some sort of explanation with every recommendation that comes out of an AI tool that grounds itself in something that a human being could check on their own. That's my firm belief, and I think that's essential to really integrating these tools into practice.
Okay, the next question that came in is that the EHR is an imbalanced set of data and excludes, to some degree, perhaps even categorically, large amounts of inputs, for example, nursing records. If we're really to get to the highest quality of decision support, now here moving back to the clinical environment, but obviously with extrapolation to the broader environment, what needs to happen at the level of data capture to be sure that we get a more rounded, fulsome picture of someone who's being cared for, at least in the institutional environment, and generalize, if you will, to the social environment?
So Jonathan, let me just add a couple of thoughts to that, which is that what Mayo Clinic has done is focused on the unstructured data. And that is every nursing note, every flow sheet, right? So when we look at our models, they're not just being trained on the structured data, the so-called common data set for interchange. It's all this unstructured data that has NLP extraction, and that can be used to create a richer model. But it's also going to be so important to bring in non-traditional data sets. As I mentioned with our work with Change Healthcare, it's the things like property tax or auto ownership or these other kinds of things that are going to provide us better insights into that patient's capacity to get equitable care.
Very, very helpful. And with that, colleagues, I am afraid that we are out of time, but what a terrific discussion, and very much appreciate the insights into how we might organize and govern and work more effectively in the formal healthcare settings. But those settings don't exist as islands. They're in the context of real world communities, and how not only work with the community, but in fact value the community, participatively support the community, appreciate those recommendations, so that we can tune. And I would take away that there likely are some overarching ethical standards, yet to a person, everyone spoke to the need to both the tuning to the local environment, as well as the need of sensitivity to both the individual who may be the recipient of AI-derived guidance, as well as the overlay of human judgment on what comes out from machine. So with that, let me thank each of the presenters, each of our colleagues who asked questions that I relayed, and turn now to Mary Naylor to facilitate our very next discussion. Thank you again. Mary?